Thank you. Okay, well, we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kathy Huffstetler, and we are so honored to have with us today 4 individuals who grew up and went to school in Oberlin Village. They've known each other since childhood, and I've come to realize they have a lot of stories that they could tell about each other. So I don't know if we'll get into those or not, but we heard a few yesterday. As I think you know by now, Oberlin Village was a rich, tight-knit community that was founded by previously enslaved persons right after the Civil War. And it always amazes me how much they accomplished in such a short period of time. And as someone said in one of the documentaries, the succeeding generations stood on the shoulders of their ancestors and became very successful and prominent. So this morning, we're going to explore what it was like to grow up in this rich environment in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And by the way, in case anybody missed it, Sabrina Good, who's the executive director of Friends of Oberlin Village, has been named Tar Heel of the Month, and I saw that in the paper this morning. So that's
awesome.
Yeah, isn't that great? And it's yeah, wow. So, so I'm going to introduce each of the 4 people, and starting with Lalia Scarborough Faison. She is a member of Wilson Temple United Methodist Church, a graduate of Broughton, studied at North Carolina State University, and retired from the Department of Instruction and is a part-time interior decorator. So thank you so much for being here, Lalia.
Thank you for asking me.
Oh, sure. And Brenda Rand Davis is our next one I'm going to introduce. There she is. She's a member of Fountain of Raleigh Fellowship Church, a graduate of Broughton too, studied at St. Aug's, and is retired from the Wake County Department of Human Services, where she worked as a Workforce Investment Act social worker. So thank you so much, Brenda, for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next person I'm going to introduce is Joe Holt. And I think, as most of you already know, he was a central figure as the teenage plaintiff in a school integration case with Raleigh Public Schools, the latter half of the 1950s. He is a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and historian, writer, and educator. Thank you, Joe, for coming today.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning to you.
Good morning. And then Darlene Coleman, who is also a member of Wilson Temple United Methodist Church. She's a retired teacher and an accomplished musician, and active with the United States Committee of Refugees and Immigrants and Church Women United. And I know this has been a very brief introduction. I know every one of you has many, many things that you're involved in, but I just gave the highlights. So I was just going to say before we start the questions that that our church, we've been neighbors with Oberlin Village since our church was founded. And now we have the privilege of getting to know the Oberlin Village residents and descendants. And I feel like we're developing a good friendship, thanks greatly to the outreach of Friends of Oberlin Village. So I'll start with the first question. And Darlene, I'll let you go first. All right.
Okay.
Could you, and this is a question I'll pose to everybody, could you describe your most treasured memory of growing up in Oberlin Village?
Well, I think the school and the church were the central point of my growing up in Oberlin, and the fact that the neighborhood, you were everybody's child. If they spoke to you, corrected you, you had to do what they said, because it got back to your house faster than a telephone message. And I think going to school and going to the church, being involved in church and school, was really what made me stay on the right track. Plus, what we call them then is nosy neighbors, you know, because they knew you. you could not get out of line. It was no if and ands about it. It was no out of line. Every neighbor in Oberlin knew who you were.
Thank you. That's I know I'm kind of envious of that. So Lolly, can you give us your impressions of your most treasured memory?
When I think about Oberlin, I think about the children. Yes, the school and the churches, they were like the center point in our lives. But we developed such good friendships that it still are deep today. Everybody's like sisters and brothers. And we were, as being a big, not a real huge community, but the children were sheltered.
Mm-hmm.
They were sheltered. As Darlene said, everybody knew who you were. And it's just the laughter that's missed, the children running up and down the streets, the kids playing on Christmas Day on at Oberlin School on the roller skates and the bicycles, and riding up and down the streets on Van Dyke and JC over there where, not JC Park is, but well, up and down Oberlin Road. So those are the most treasured memories that I have learned to just treasure all my life.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Brenda, I'll let you chime in.
Okay, well, there were so many wonderful things that we experienced growing up in Oberlin. I think for me, it was how the community just loved all of us. They disciplined us. They made sure, as Lolly and Darlene said, that we were always on the right track, and those messages traveled really quickly to our parents. I also really enjoyed that I had a lot of family in that community, cousins on my father's side, cousins on my mother's side. So it was just one big family for us. The other thing that really worked well for me was just having all of our friends. We went to the same school. We had those wonderful teachers, and that just made for a really good community for us.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Thank you. And Joe?
Well, kind of like Brenda, it was hard to define or select a particular treasured memory. When I thought about the adventure that I had every afternoon when I was carrying papers, I was a Raleigh Times carrier. That was the evening paper. And as I walked through the neighborhood, I guess I was around the 7th grade, that's when I first began to get a sense that I lived really in kind of a quaint village, kind of like the village in the Village Blacksmith poem, or in the poem by Longfellow, Evangeline. And as I walked through the community in the afternoon carrying the papers, it was always an adventure. And I began to look forward to feeling the sense of community and witnessing the sense of community. I would see ladies talking to each other who live right across the street, just kind of passing the time of day, carrying on casual conversation. And you could sense from them the warmth and the affection that they felt toward each other as neighbors. And then I began to sense that I was a part of all that. I was surrounded by a community of people who felt warm toward each other. I remember when I collected for the paper on Friday nights, particularly in the wintertime, people would ask you to come on in the house so you could get warm. So I was invited into the living rooms, and I sensed that I was not a stranger. I began to realize that I wasn't a stranger because everyone knew my mom and dad. And so it was important to always be on your best behavior because of that. The word, as someone said, would get back if you weren't. And also the word would get back if you were well behaved. And that was a plus with your parents. So I remember that. I remember walking down through the wooded sections because that provided some quietude and tranquility. I just really enjoyed walking through the wooded sections and just being in the woods and where it was tranquil. The single most happy day for me, you know, was the day we got out of school for summer. I looked forward to getting out of school. So all I would have to do was play and wouldn't have to do homework. And so that was the happiest day of the year for me, the last day of school.
Right. I think we can identify with that. It's no other feeling like it.
Kathy, before you go on, I just want to add to what all of us have said. There was no class distinction in that neighborhood.
Right.
Everybody was the same. You know, it wasn't a matter of being elite and middle class and low class. Everybody was treated the same. You know, you were just somebody's child that everybody helped raise. You know, that was the one unique thing about Oberlin Village.
Right. That sounds like a utopia right there. Okay. Thank you very much for those, for sharing your feelings about that. Okay. The second question, how did growing up in Oberlin Village affect your values and goals in life? And I'll start again with Darlene.
Like I said, everybody helped you grow up. You know, it was just a matter of you were always wanting to be on your best behavior, because I remember the telephone was a party line. It might be 5 or 6 people on it. So you misbehaved and somebody got on that party line to call your mom and somebody else was on there, they tell them, and then the word got back to them before you could even get home. So it was a matter of you always wanted to be on your best behavior at all times. At school, if you got in trouble, how did they find out before you got home from school? They knew. And it helped me realize that my best potential was to be an amazing adult if I ever got to be an adult, because with the punishments we got, you were not sure whether you're going to be an adult or not. You know, you had to count those days and time.
That's good. Well, you are an adult, so you know, congratulations.
Made it through.
You made it.
A seasoned adult.
A seasoned adult. And Lalia, how about you?
Well, the community shaped our values. It shaped each child. We were told we can do anything you want to do. You want to do in life, you can do it. Mm-hmm. We had things to look forward to. We had teachers over at Oberlin School that showed us the world beyond Oberlin. They were so creative, and they just helped build our characters and our morals. Mm-hmm. They were just and with the parents enforcing everything, it was just a good time at Oberlin to grow up. We know that we had trials and tribulations to go through, and we just took it step by step, and our parents helped us to take those steps step by step. Whenever we went to another side of town or someone would talk to us, especially Caucasian people, they would immediately say, "You're from Oberlin, aren't you?" And I would proudly say, "Yes, I am. This is what we can tell." It was just a great atmosphere in Oberlin to grow up. That's it.
That's it. That's wonderful. Brenda.
Is she on mute?
Yep. Hold on just a second, Miss Brenda.
She's on mute.
All right. I asked unmute. There might be a button coming up. There we go.
Okay. Well, yes, growing up in Oberlin was just awesome because as everyone has already said, the community, everyone in the community was a parent substitute for us when our parents weren't around. And so many things, so many people looked out for us. We could not do wrong and get away with it. We had people, if we were just walking down the street, we never knew who was looking out of their windows or just sitting on their porches watching us to make sure we were protected. And that gave us the ability to walk any place that we wanted to go within the walls of Oberlin, which was just awesome. One of the things I really remember and appreciate is that my Aunt Hazel was a school teacher, and she had really started, I don't know what year it was that she began teaching, but my brother, our next door neighbor, Barbara Jean Worth, and I were her quote unquote guinea pigs. And every afternoon, she even got little chairs and little desks for us and put them on the front porch. And we had to sit down with her and have a lesson after we'd been in school all day, and we still had homework to do. So that's something that I really treasured.
Yeah, that's what a sweet memory. Thank you. Joe?
Well, values and goals. I'm going to speak first to goals. I think it was my goal to be recognized as someone whose behavior and decorum and accomplishment in school were well spoken of by the adults in the community. That was my goal, to be recognized as a person whose behavior and decorum and accomplishment in school were worthy of someone speaking commendably about it. Not just the adults, but my peers. I wanted to be thought well of by my peers. Anything that would make my parents proud. There were certain older guys in the community who, this term came into vogue later on, talk about role models. At that time, the term role model was not in vogue. But there were certain older guys in the community who were, for me, role models. And I wanted to be like those guys. And these were individuals who set the example in terms of behavior and decorum and accomplishment in school. And so that was my goal, to be like them. In terms of how Oberlin affected my values, I don't think that's something that resonated with me until I got into my 30s. I began to look back, and I think after I reached my 30s and I began to think about where I grew up, when I began to look at all the other people I encountered in my life. And it occurred to me at that point in time in my 30s, I think, that my interest in just trying to do the right thing, trying to do what was honorable, was traceable in some degree, perhaps in large degree, to the Oberlin community which shaped me. So my goal was to be a good guy, and there were guys who set that example. And in terms of values, I wanted to be an honorable person and do the right thing, and Oberlin shaped me in that way.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I think everyone achieved their goals, so that's wonderful. So the next question is, how did discrimination against Blacks and segregation impact you as a child and your view of the world? And we'll start with Darlene.
Well, I think growing up, because my grandmother raised me, and she was like, well, she was 95 when she died, so she was born like in 1895. I thought that was the way of life. I didn't realize the difference and how we were discriminated against, because she followed the rule. That was the law according to her, and you didn't break the law. Like the time we drank out of the white water fountain in J.C. Penney, where we got punished. But we just, because that was the law. She just abided by that law. And I'll never forget, at Oberlin School, I've always been musically inclined. I wanted to take orchestra lessons, where Raleigh City Schools would not allow a teacher to come teach one little, what they call colored child at Oberlin School, because I was the only one that wanted to take orchestra. And my mom had already rented my viola for me to take lessons, and Raleigh City Schools would not allow that teacher to come teach me. So then I started with the piano at the age of 8, taking lessons down what they call Cameron Village now, because all those homes were Black-owned homes, and the piano teacher lived down there. So I did not get to take viola lessons, because I was the only colored child, as they called us back then, that wanted to be in the orchestra.
Wow. Thank you, darling. Lalia?
Well, as Darlene said, there was a rule, and we just naturally gave in to the rules and just processed and did what our parents told us to do so we wouldn't be in trouble. Racially, the racial thing really came to light for me is was sitting on the front porch. And when Jill tried to get into Broughton High School, and they started throwing bottles and cans and anything that they could at not only his house, but our house too. Then it cut into our playtime. That means we couldn't be even on the sidewalk to play. We had to be in the house at a certain time, or on that porch at a certain time, and we couldn't go out until the next day. It also, but I did have a lot of white people in my life that aided us. My mother and father had 11 children. And my mother did day work, and my father, he was a custodian down at F.W. Woolworth and at Car Drugs at the time, and at Rose's. So I know we could, when we were growing up, we couldn't even go in to get shoes. We had to draw, our mothers had to draw, my mother had to draw our feet on a piece of paper, and she would have someone to go into the store with those pieces of paper and to hold them up against the shoes to see if we could be able to wear them.
Wow.
So we had somebody to, and it was most of the time, it was one of the ladies she did day work for. It started getting really bad when we, in the 7th grade, 8th grade. We had to go to 8th grade at Daniels Middle School, but then now Oberlin Middle School, we were told that we can't, the counselors and things and teachers had told us we weren't going to be able to do this. You can't do that. You just go on and do home ec. Go on and take home ec, and that'd probably be about the best thing you do. Maybe you can find a good maid job. So that was one of the things that we held against the whites at the point in time, because there was no inspiration given us from the schools, which we resented, because we at Oberlin School, we were told we could do anything we wanted to do. But when we started going to integrated schools, we were told, you can't do that. You can't do this. You can't do that. So a lot of people did settle, but the majority of us pushed on and did more than what we were told we could do.
Wow. You pushed on. That's a testament to how you were raised. Okay, Brenda, thank you so much, Lolly.
Wow, that brought back memories. One thing that had a really big impact on me in terms of really understanding discrimination is that one day, I mean, when we were old enough to walk to Cameron Village to go to the store, if our parents or my mother or grandmother needed something, we could do that. And I was walking to Colonial Store one afternoon, and it was actually on a Saturday, and there were 2 white adult couples walking up the sidewalk, and they were side by side. So I either had to step aside to let them pass, or I just stood there waiting for them to move to the side so that I could walk straight. And they, of course, didn't do that. And one of the ladies said some really ugly things to me, trying to tell me to move and call me the N-word. But I refused to move. And she just looked at me, but none of the other three said anything. I could not wait to get home to tell my mother of that experience, because I just didn't understand how people could be so mean and just take up the whole sidewalk, and they clearly saw me. So Mom explained to me, you know, that I was going to probably encounter things like that as I grew up, because that's the way Black people were treated by some people. And I just thought it was terrible. And I think I even told her, well, if they treat me like that on the street, I don't want to go to their schools. I like my school.
Yeah.
And of course, things changed, you know, later. One of the things I distinctly remember that bothered me so much at Oberlin School were the books that we were given to read and to study from. And when you'd open the book, there was always a thing on the inside cover for you to write your name, because that was going to be your book for that year. And oftentimes there were too many other names there for you to write your name. And the teacher might tell you to turn to page 10. Well, you start flipping through and there's no page 10, or things on page 10 have been scribbled on, have been crossed out. You couldn't even read it. And that would be throughout that book and most books that we had. But we had such great teachers who were so creative that we were still able to learn what they expected us to learn. And we experienced so many good things from our teachers, from the first grade, Mrs. Wilder. I mean, there was so much. Mrs. Campbell, who lived in the neighborhood. Just awesome people who looked out for us. And I remember some of the things that they gave us, they had taken the time to just rewrite and fill in on blank paper the things that they expected us to learn and the things they taught us. And, you know, they had those old copy things. I don't even remember what you call it, but they had to turn the wheel.
Memograph.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So they were determined that we were going to learn. And we did. We progressed and we did what we needed to do. And so many kids were bused. I remember kids from Daniels get on their bus coming up Oberlin Road in the afternoon when we were getting out of school and crossing the street to walk whichever way we needed to go. And this particular day, they were calling us names. They were throwing things out of the window.
Spitting out the window.
Yes, yes, it was just horrible. So the next day we decided, a bunch of us, that we weren't going to accept that. So we had little things that we were going to throw on the bus. And I'll never forget, I don't know if I should call her name, but Maxine had a little potato chip bag that she filled with dirt. And when the bus came by and they started throwing things, Maxine probably should have been a professional baseball player, because she had that little bag and she threw that bag so hard and it hit a girl in the face. And that dirt just went everywhere. And we felt badly about it, but at the same time, it was revenge for us for the things they had done to us the day before.
Right.
So, of course, the next day when we arrived at school, all of us had to go to the auditorium, I think, and Mr. Haywood had a really frank discussion with us about what had happened and how we were not to do that. You can't retaliate. People do what they do. And the principal from Daniels actually came to Broughton and had a meeting, to Oberlin, and had a meeting with Mr. Haywood and some of the teachers, because at that point it was getting out of hand.
Yeah.
So that was not a good time. And then when I left, of course, there I went to Daniels. And one of the worst experiences there was when President Kennedy was assassinated. And all of us were ushered out of the school onto the playground. And I often wondered if they thought there was going to be a riot in their school with kids our age, but they took us out. We had to stay out there for hours and with no explanation. And this one guy, I'll never forget him, looked at me and said, "What are you Ian's going to do now?"
Wow.
And that was just horrible. And I didn't respond. I knew better than to respond. And then, when I got home, I remember my Uncle Nate coming over and we sat down and talked about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was at Daniels the same time you were, Brenda.
Yes.
And, yeah. Of course, we didn't know each other then. That's just, as I said earlier, we're worlds apart at that point.
Yes.
So glad we know each other now. Thank you so much. And Joe.
Well, I want to begin by saying something. I get a lot of attention and publicity for having been the student who was the central figure in the effort to integrate the schools. But I've said to some of my peers, and I don't want to embarrass anybody who's here by calling you peers because you're much younger than I am. But your stories and their stories need to be told too. While I led the effort to achieve education equality or to integrate the schools, what about those like Brenda and Laya and Darlene and others who walked into the fire? You all caught the hell. And your stories need to be told. And I've told that many times to reporters and to other people, that those stories need to be told. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's the story. Brenda's account of being on the sidewalk and encountering people who are mean to her, that's an example, some people would say, of the typical microaggressions that Blacks face today. Mm-hmm. But that's more than a microaggression, if you ask me. And it requires you to find a lot of personal courage, as Brenda had to find to stand her ground. I don't even like to use that term because of what it reminds me about Trayvon Martin. But we always have to call on this resource. We always have to look deep inside and bear up and be brave. And that's the story of our lives as Black people. All of these aggressions that we confront even today. So I'm glad you're telling those stories. And I applaud those of you who are younger than me for your personal courage. And again, I think every one of your stories needs to be told. That's a part of that process. That's a part of that period of time. Segregation was a way of life when I was young, as with them. And I don't think I ever heard the word segregation until I was about the 7th grade. The Brown versus Board ruling occurred in 1954 in May, and I began 7th grade in the fall of '54. So I might have in fact heard the word prior to that time in 1953, but it wasn't something that really resonated with me because I hadn't really heard that word used to describe the law and the custom that separated people based on race and color. So my first understanding of this definition of of segregation, I'm looking at some notes here, was the result of the context in which it was used. We can't go where white people go. We can't do what white people do. We can't do this, we can't do that white people can do because of this thing called segregation. Again, I never heard the word until I was around the 7th grade. I think I can honestly say, I know I can honestly say, and you've already heard it, that none of us like segregation. Say it another way, all of us disliked it. We hated it. I'm going to go so far as to say we despised it because it demeaned us. It disrespected us. We resented intensely not being seen as people, not being seen as having anything about us that was honorable or noble or intellectual, being seen as naturally inferior and subordinate, being seen as people who just naturally accepted that it was okay for white people to think that we were less than they were, not as good as they. It created for me, it created for us, I think, a view of the world that was burdensome. It was a burden. One in which you felt you always had to prove something to some white person or to white people in general to prove that you were deserving of treatment, decent treatment as a human being, that you were deserving of the same regard, being held in the same regard that they took for granted. And even if you did prove it, it didn't matter. You were still seen as inferior. You could never be as good as a white person. That was burdensome. It's burdensome today. Even if he or she were the most ignorant, uneducated, depraved individual that you could find, that person was still someone who was better than you because they were white. I listened to what Malaya said, and I just became angry and infuriated all over again to hear from someone I personally know. And Laya's like my little sister. One of her younger brothers thought I was his brother because I was at their house every day. Okay, he really thought I was his brother. Okay, all right. And I didn't know that until I was grown. Tony told me that. Not Tony, Curtis. Oh yeah, okay. But when someone says to you that, no, you should not be interested in this, you should pursue this over here because it suggests to you that you just don't have the capability of the intellect. That infuriates me to hear that right now. I want to relate a little story. Again, this goes kind of back to Laya, because she and her older brother and I, when we were children, we were best friends, right on up through our teenage years. James, you all know him as Buttercup.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Back shortly after Cameron Village opened, on Sundays, some of us would walk down there just to have something to do, to entertain ourselves. And Buttercup and I went down to the village one Sunday, and we went to Carl Rexall drugstore, which was located then right there near the Bryan building. And we probably didn't know any better. I don't know. We couldn't have known any better. But we walked in the store. We knew that there were places that blacks and whites couldn't go, but we just didn't understand just how thoroughgoing it was. So we probably were 9 years old. And we walked in Carl Rexall on Sunday afternoon, and there was a lunch counter there, and white people were seated there. So what? Well, we walked up to the counter, and no one paid any attention to us, but there was a young black woman who worked there, Geraldine Lynn, who used to live at Miss Danny Morgan's when she was in high school. She was from out around Jeffers Grove, but she knew us. And she finally came and said, "What are y'all doing in here?" And we said, "Well, we want to get an ice cream cone." "You can't get an ice cream cone in here." And we just stood there and looked at her. And she finally said, "Well, come on, go down to the end of the counter and don't you say anything, and I'll be down there in a few minutes." She finally came down there and she said, "You want an ice cream cone? You're not supposed to come in here and ask for an ice cream cone." We're standing there looking like, "Oh, do you have the money?" Between us, we might have had 12 cents, okay? But we had enough money to get an ice cream cone. And so each one of us bought an ice cream cone. She said, "Now you get out of here because you can't eat it in here." So I remember that example. That was down in Cameron. Okay. So that's we grew up with segregation. I came to learn the word, had never heard it until I was in the 7th grade. But in terms of how it affected us, in terms of how it affected me, it was burdensome.
Mm.
That was the effect I think it had on us.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I think back on my life and the handful of times that maybe I was slighted and not appreciated or demeaned or whatever, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times in my whole life, and how it just set me back. And the fact that y'all had to deal with this on a daily basis. And yet, as you said, you pushed through, and it's just amazing to me. I have a couple other questions, but one question that came through the chat, which I think is good, is this. Do any of the panelists have suggestions as to how to renew the spirit and values of Oberlin community here and now?
I saw that, and I'm gonna tell you, the first thing that came to my mind was how these new developers want to come into Oberlin Village, change the names of the streets. And I'm trying to figure out, I bet they wouldn't go in Oakwood, Hayesbar, Mordecai, and change not one street name for their advantage. I think that's the worst thing you can do. And I'm wondering, why are they doing that? That's, to me, total disrespect for Oberlin Village, period, for what we've already gone through. They wouldn't go in Oakwood and Mordecai and Hayesbar and change no street name. And why are they wanting to do it to Oberlin Village?
I echo her sentiments very strongly, not just changing the street name, but calling Oberlin itself Cameron Village.
Exactly.
That's been going on for some time. That concerns me. And I call these people corporate intruders. For those who are new residents who've come into Oberlin, they're living down there on Bedford Avenue, Tower Street, down on Ladder Street, and talking about they're living in Cameron Village. Well, I didn't grow up in Cameron Village. I grew up in Oberlin, okay? Darlene grew up in Oberlin. Laya, Brenda, we all grew up in Oberlin. And Oberlin, we all know where it is. We all know what those boundaries were. That was a fence, and it still probably is up. If you walk down the end of Turner Lane, Glover,
that's right.
Fence down there that says, hey, you all over here, we are over there. So it just annoys me and aggravates me to no end to have Oberlin referred to as Cameron Village. Cameron Village was separate and distinct. They didn't want to have anything really to do with us back then.
They put the fence up.
Yeah.
When they developed it, they put the fence up. We didn't put a fence up.
Right. So that really disturbs me, But in terms of trying to answer Kathy's question, we need to publicize and publicize and publicize to promote, to inform people. We need to educate the community that Oberlin exists, it existed, and it exists now. There's Oberlin ground and there's Cameron Village ground. We did not make that decision. That decision was made elsewhere. So now don't come in and appropriate Oberlin and call it Cameron Village.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Peebles lived there on the corner of Oberlin Road and Turner Lane or Glover Lane. They're calling that Cameron Village. Nelson and Dwight and Neltine didn't grow up in Cameron Village, and Wilma Peebles didn't either.
Mm-hmm. That's it. Gentrification is a big problem out there in Oberlin. And the issues of housing versus income out there in Oberlin. A lot of black people, black families that were living in Oberlin, they've had to move because they've been out taxed by the big houses going up, and they still have their little small houses, and they couldn't afford the taxes. And with gentrification, all the homes have been torn down and big monstrous houses have been built. And what only thing we can say is, so-and-so used to live there, but they tore the house down and it's no more. They got taxed out because everything around them just leaves them as a shadow. in the abyss. Oberlin has lost a lot of its culture and a lot of its flavor because of gentrification. That's it.
Yeah. Brenda, did you want to add anything?
Thank you for the calm voice. Randy and Raven out there.
I certainly agree with what everyone has said about the changes that have taken place. Some people have tried to avoid those, but because of taxes and because of, in a lot of cases, some homeowners who have passed on don't have the relatives here to still fight to save their property. And I just think it's deplorable that this is happening to our community where we grew up. And then people don't want to listen. They're just totally disrespecting us. And that's a shame. That should not happen. But we'll still fight for what we believe in.
Yeah. Well, the spirit and the values that you grew up with, you're carrying them forward. And I know a lot of people from Oberlin ended up migrating to the north and elsewhere in the country, and they carry that same spirit and values too. And you know, I really appreciate hearing about all that because it's so rich and it's so pure, you know, which y'all had. I mean, I'm not sure it's as much the case for some of the rest of us who didn't grow up in that community. It seems like our existence was maybe more diluted or something. But
Kathy, may I interject something very
sure.
quickly? I just want to let everybody know, and I want to say personally thank you to Kathy, because just a few days, I sent out a number of emails to a lot of people asking them if they would please send a letter to the Wake Med corporate staff or the executive staff to inform them that we would like to see the new Wake Med facility contain the name Wake Med at Oberlin or Wake Med at Oberlin Village, as opposed to Wake Med at Cameron Village. That's just an example of the erasure of our culture. And Kathy Hustetler responded right away with a very strong letter supporting the naming of the new Wake Med facility as Wake Med at Oberlin. Kathy, I want to thank you so much for doing that, and I want the rest of you to know that she did that. Yeah.
I appreciate that, Joe.
Yeah.
Can I say something? This is Cheryl Williams, and thank you everybody for participating. Thank you for the audience of both churches coming together. And when you talk about what can we do to make things better, to instill that that feeling of neighborly community love for each other, it's with interactions like this. We're sharing our side of the story. You know, perhaps we can come together at another time and you share your side, because there's always two sides to the coin. I find that when we start talking on this level, we share things, and I'm sure there's people at both churches that say, I did that when I was young. My parents did that. We are so much more alike than different, because we're people. And we are also Christians. And so, you know, the new commandment, when Jesus died, you know, that threw away that veil of differences. And we all have a way to communicate with God and to do God's commandment, which is love God, love your neighbor. And if we can do activities that foster that, inclusive with us together, then I think we can get back to some of the values and the character that we were talking about that was so special about Oberlin. It was happening all over the country in many places. Yeah, it was snuffed out in some places very violently, but today we have a chance, just in this few minutes that we've spent together, to overcome that, to open up our minds, to be willing to talk to each other and stand up for each other. So I echo what Joe and Kathy said, you know, let's work together and help each other to keep the spirit of Oberlin alive, because that spirit is the spirit that will bring us together as a community, and I think as a country.
This is Andrew. Can I jump
Yeah.
in?
Yes, Andrea, nice to see you again. Thank you.
Andrew?
Hi. So thank you for allowing me to join. I'm probably past. I was a generation that I was born in 1963, so I didn't get a chance to go to any of the Oberlin school or experience any of the segregated schools, but I was a recipient of, once the schools became integrated, I started off at the elementary school, Sherwood Bakes, as is now gone, and then and I can remember, this is back in the 60s, late 60s, 70s, that one of the things that I experienced was the great friendship that we had at JC Park. You know, some of y'all might not remember, but they used to have every year, and a lot of you, all the Scarboroughs, we used to go down to JC Park, and hot summers we used to spend outside because we didn't have enough money to do the inside JC. We were outside at the picnic table. And even though how miserable the heat was, we never noticed it. And we had brought in lunch because none of us could afford lunch. And as we said, we were all very relatively poor. And I also remember how we used to walk almost a mile to the swimming pool that was at Pullen Park, but we skipped the one that was at Hayes Barton, which was a somewhat, I don't know if y'all even recall, my life was somewhat of a segregated, even though no signs were up. Very few of us was welcome at Hayes Barton Pool, which is now
You're
gone.
right.
It was a private pool. It was a private pool.
It was a private pool.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I also remember, because I grew up right on Oberlin Road, and I used to always wondered, it was 6 of us in a 900 square foot home with 1 bath. And I used to always wonder, when I used to go down to walk to school to Daniels Elementary, I used to pass this huge Tatum Hall, huge houses. And I always wondered, why is it all of us are in the small houses, but all the whites in these gigantic houses? And, you know, I recall being, and then I used to go to 5 Points, if y'all ever remember, you know, 5 Points. I used to always ask myself, why is no blacks live in 5 Points? And even to this day, I tell people, I still never see nobody black live in 5 Points. Maybe they are, just never seen. So one of the things too that I also experienced as a child was, why am I walking past this huge white church, white memorial church, actually during the 70s, were on TV? I was like, who can be on TV during the 70s during that time? And I walked past them and saw all this wealth. But then when I went to Winston's Temple Church, an Oberlin Baptist church, a very, very small church. And I always thought, how could we call ourselves brothers and sisters, but live such separate lives growing up? And I always saw that being a great divide. A divide during the summers when we spend our time at JC Park, a divide during Sundays when we worship apart, and also a divide during where we actually worked. I actually, you know, my mother couldn't find a job as a school teacher in Raleigh. Never got interviewed. Never could understand that. They had to go to Georgia. So I was the experience of, I went to all the white schools, but now, you know, I look back, when I was in all the white schools, from Sherwood Bakes to Daniels to Broughton, a large majority of us was in what they called it special ed. Never understood why so many black kids of us were in special ed. And I always thought that, you know, even though we fought for segregation, I often wondered, was I really deprived? You know, when I hear the stories of my older sister and of y'all, of the care and the warmth that y'all got from the black teachers, I always thought I was deprived of that. I never got that. That's all I wanted to share.
Thank you so much for doing that, Andrea. I really appreciate it.
May I say something too,
Yes.
real quick? This doesn't have to do necessarily with education. The other day or yesterday or whenever it was, Kathy, you asked something about farms.
Yeah.
In Oberlin.
Right.
Andrew, I imagine you know this, but one of the farms in Oberlin was owned by your grandfather, I believe it's Charlie Durham.
Mhm.
Was his name Charlie? Charlie Durham? Oh, well, he's not. Okay.
He's on mute.
He's on mute. But anyway, Mr. Charlie Durham owned something of a farm. It wasn't the biggest one in Oberlin, but he had a horse and wagons. And during the summertime, he would come down Oberlin Road with a wagon full of produce, and he'd stop along the way, and people would come out and buy produce from him. That was Andrew's grandfather.
Mhm.
Ah,
And then, yes, I did hear that. My mother told me that story, but she also told me that he had to sell the horse for her to go to Shaw University.
Mm.
ah.
She-
Well, I'm so glad this is being recorded. It's just fascinating. And so I think we recently learned too that the land that what used to be called Daniels Middle School and now is named Oberlin Middle School was owned by a newly freed enslaved person named Maddie Curtis, and it was I guess a farm, and she was a farmer and an entrepreneur. I think Cheryl told me that.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was, I think she grew tobacco and cotton, or one of the cash crops at the time. And I was told by Ruth Little that vegetables, fruit, chicken, pigs, a cow, and that probably people had a lot of pecan trees on the farms. So yeah, many of those that first generation was farmers. And if you could imagine, it was all woods. So these people had to come and clear the land, build their homes, build the churches, create a business, a way to make a living after being enslaved. And there were a few freed people here already, but it took, that village grew and prospered through all the obstacles.
Yes, because there were fruit trees, every kind of tree that you wanted in Oberlin. You have to go to this house and that house and whatever, but every tree that was in Oberlin, you can get your apples, you can get your pears, you can get your plums, everywhere.
Blackberries. The whole back lot of Ladder property was nothing but blackberries.
Yeah.
That whole acre on the back was nothing but blackberries.
So Oberlin was sufficient. Only thing I see that we couldn't have gotten was meat, but there was always chickens. I don't know where all those chickens, Lean Turner did the chickens.
Well, we had some too.
Yeah, chickens too.
And so did
No, Joe,
John
you had
Baker's
ducks.
grandmother.
And Mrs. Danny Morgan raised chickens, and we did too.
My grandmama had chickens too.
Yeah.
So,
John Baker's grandmother had the meanest rooster in Oberlin. He would attack people walking up and down the street.
no, we had the meanest rooster in Oberlin because he would go across the street to Cheryl's grandmother's house and attack her dog every time he would come out. And so my mother had to finally put him to rest, and nobody was going to eat him until she put them in the freezer, and we forgot about him, and she pulled him out one day. I said, oh, it's the best chicken. Oh, that was so-and-so that was a bully around the neighborhood.
So we've got, well, it's 10:45, so we probably should be wrapping it up. I could do this all day long, listen to y'all talk. I mean, I hate for it to have to end at a certain time. But so what we're going to do is to end this. I'll do a closing prayer, and then hopefully all of Wilson Temple and all the rest of you from other churches or no churches know how to log into our shared live stream worship service. And I'm just so glad that we're doing that. I'm looking forward to Pastor Brady's sermon, and Cheryl, I think, is going to give the children's sermon. It's going to be great. And then I can't wait till the day that we can actually be physically together in the sanctuary. Yes. That's going to be wonderful.
Yes. We can visit each other's churches, and you can experience a Black service, and we can experience a white service.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So Thank you so much for all of you who participated. It means the world to us for you to be so candid and share your feelings and stories. And it's a great gift to us, and I truly thank you. And I've had, several people on the chat, so they're also chiming in and saying thank you. And because it's being recorded, I know one person on chat said she wanted the children to listen to this recording too, because it'll mean a lot to them to hear how y'all grew up. So I'll do the closing prayer, and then we'll stop our session. But if anybody has any technical questions about getting on to the church live stream service, they can stay on and ask Anna. And Anna has done a beautiful job of coordinating all this for us, and I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, thank you. Very good.
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah. All right, so here's the closing prayer. Lord, thank you for everyone gathered here today. Bless the growing friendship between folks who were previously separated by harmful laws and behavior, imbalance of power, and injustice that cast a pall on all of humankind. Nurture us as we work side by side to right the wrongs we find in this world that we share. Help us to recognize that if one of us suffers, we all suffer, and that we are in this together and stronger when we're united. Hallelujah and amen.
Amen.